At 7 p.m. on September 30th, 1965, viewers of ATV Midlands were the very first to see the latest Supermarionation production from AP Films, the television studio based in Slough that had already enjoyed huge success with Supercar, Fireball XL5 and Stingray. This new series was to be the biggest and most expensive production the company had mounted so far. Yet the idea for the series itself was born out of tragedy, following a mine disaster that had caught the attention of the world almost 2 years earlier.
First of all, the idea of Thunderbirds was triggered by the German mine disaster. A lot of miners were trapped underground. I remember listening on my car radio and hearing that their oxygen was running out and a big drill was being brought in by train, and there were news flashes.
In this last rescue operation, the most crucial moment came a few minutes after 5 a.m., long before anybody expected.
On October 24th, 1963, a lake directly over an iron mine in Germany collapsed, and at least 40 men lost their lives as water flooded into the galleries. Miraculously, more than twice that number were able to escape to the surface within just a few hours. A small pocket of 20 survivors, however, had fled to a disused section of the mine. With no way in or out, and their numbers now reduced to 11, teams on the surface hatched a desperate rescue plan.
Because of the danger of burying the men alive, it had been planned to sink the shaft outside the chamber and dig a way through to the men. As it was, the escape shaft emerged in the northeast corner of the men's cabin, and the much-feared fall of rock and earth did not take place. Waiting in their cabin, listening to the drill, the miners suddenly warned the rescuers that the sound of the drill was getting heavy, and now they reported a slight fall of stones. This was the first indication the rescuers had that their shaft might penetrate the chamber itself. The operations van called down to the miners, "Are the stones falling from the point at which the noise of the drill is loudest?" The reply, "Yes." "Excellent, stay well clear and keep reporting." Seconds later, a bellow from below stopped drilling, and then a deafening rush of compressed air lasting several seconds. Quietly but tensely and repeatedly as the sound died away, they called, "Hello below, report please, report please." A pause, then coughing and spluttering. "We're all right, the place is full of dust." "Are your men all calm?" came the question. "Yes, quite calm. The dust is clearing now. The whole place wobbled, but it seems to be holding up." Very slowly, drilling then started again. The tip of the drill was still several feet from the men's ceiling. It was the compressed air used to blow the loose earth to the surface that had broken through to the men. A second moment of danger was still ahead. This one came just before 9 o'clock. Working now with the care of archaeologists, the drillers inched their way downwards, and again all went well. "We can see the tip of the drill," came the call from below, "and it's a clean round hole. Fall of earth negligible." Withdrawing the drill, the third dangerous moment, went equally well, and all was now set for lining the rest of the shaft with steel tubes. This operation went like clockwork, and so did the final rescue itself. The final stage was accomplished with a barely credible smoothness. It took 2.5 hours from the moment the escape cylinder, empty, was lowered on a test run through the shaft to the shout we heard from the inside of the chamber when the last man was safely above ground. 2.5 hours of tension that left one weak at the knees. The entire operation took place out of sight, down in the gallery, inside the escape shaft, and in the pressure chamber at the top. The escape cylinder was lowered at 10:15 GMT, a test run that gave the miners their first glimpse of the capsule that was to rescue them. They greeted it as they've greeted every milestone in their 8 days underground, cheerfully and calmly, and promptly sent it up again as they'd been told to. The next milestone, 45 long minutes later, was the arrival in the capsule of the foreman who'd volunteered to see them to the top. And now, the first of the 3 trapped men, Polai, the youngest, was to ascend. As they strapped him in, their leader, Hanush, grunted into the microphone, "He's a tight fit. He's been eating too much, but we'll get him in." They did, and at 12 minutes past 11, he reached the top. And now the operation gathered speed. Less than 5 minutes later, Hanush and the foreman were strapping in the miner Leda. "He's the biggest. Can you get him in?" called a voice from the operations van. He must be got in, called Harnish, obviously straining. And a second later, triumphantly, he shouted, he's in, and we could get another in on top of him. 3 minutes for the ride, and the second man was up, 11:23. 2 minutes after past, Harnish himself was on the surface. A great moment, this. He has a lot of admirers, this middle-aged miner. And then finally, the tricky business of bringing up the foreman, Siska, who'd volunteered to go below to send the others up. Siska's ascent had been carefully planned. He had to travel without a safety belt, for there was no one there to strap him in. And because no one was left to guide the capsule through the hole in the ceiling, he did it himself and mounted the capsule from a bench. He was to give his own order for the ascent, and in case the mic was out of reach, they made one test call up the shaft 260 feet to the men manning the winch above. This was perhaps the most dramatic sound of all. It echoed up the pipe, langsam auf, slowly up, and then we heard the clanking of the cylinder against the walls of the shaft for the last time. 3 minutes later, a burst of cheerful sound from the pressure chamber, crowded now, and we knew that the rescue was over. 11:39. Dead silence from everyone listening, and then people turned away from each other and walked off in different directions, getting a grip on themselves.
I think this is what really inspired me, that, if you have a disaster of this size, and you really need to bring in all the heavy gear. It is a massive rescue operation, and it's international, because if somebody's got the right kind of crane, they're going to send it, aren't they?
The disaster had occurred while Stingray was still in production, and shortly before Gerry Anderson was due to meet with Lou Grade to discuss ideas for the next AP film series. But as Gerry later recalled, the process of transition from one show to another was not always as smooth as it might have seemed.
We would be shooting Stingray, and towards the end I would go to Lou with a new idea. And clearly he had to put the idea to the Americans, he had to sow a few seeds, he had to make sure that he could sell it. He probably had to ensure the company had the cash flow, not just for my shows, but there are many other things going on. So, he was never able to give a go-ahead. On the very first day I said, we must talk about a new series. In principle, I used to put the ideas to him early enough in order to get the go to start spending money kind of the day after we finished shooting the previous series. But there were times when we would be held up for perhaps 3 or 4 weeks whilst Lou was checking this out and that out. And in that time, we would lay some staff off. We would overhaul equipment. We would perhaps be designing for the new show. It was always very difficult to do anything until we were told to go ahead. But in principle, we really never stopped. I mean, to have a break of 3 weeks between major productions is something that's almost unheard of today. At that time, Lou was saying, what's the new show? And I came up with this idea for International Rescue, which I then called Thunderbirds. The series was commissioned by Lou. He was very supportive. I was the one who wanted to go bigger and better all the time, but he was right there supporting me. I didn't have to talk him into it. I mean, it was two like minds.
With the idea for the new series now agreed with Lou Grade, Gerry and his wife Sylvia set off to their holiday home in Portugal to write the first episode, Trapped in the Sky.
The only way I could write was really to dictate. I dictated the show, and I had to go fast because, you're inventing it as you're going along, and to try to remember where all the characters were, and this, that and the other is really quite difficult. Now, obviously, I had devoted a lot of time myself to thinking about the plot and the basic structure. It was never discussed with the crew until the first script was finished, revised, printed, and then circulated.
With the script for the first episode now completed, it was time for production to get started back in Slough. One of the first and most important tasks was the design of the 5 Thunderbirds craft, the job of which fell to Derek Meddings.
I was very specific in my brief, and I can tell you what my brief was, and I can tell you what he did.
5.
My brief was a space station which had panoramic windows and Thunderbird 5, cut out on the windows. But it had to be large enough to have this great big bank of tape recorders all listening to the various frequencies, and that it was in permanent orbit. End of brief. Everything else was Derek Meddings. Thunderbird 4 I had described as a one-man underwater craft and given no indication whatsoever about the design, so that was totally Derek.
3.
Well, 3 was a space rocket. The design of it didn't excite me too much then, and looking back, I think it was just a rocket.
2.
Thunderbird 2 was described as a big, lumbering cargo ship capable of carrying huge weights at high speed for that kind of aircraft. All the rest was Derek Meddings, including the idea of the interchangeable pods, which of course was an absolutely wonderful idea.
1.
That was based on logical thought. A small one-man craft today can go, Mach 4, and equally today Galaxy C5A, the American gigantic cargo aircraft, I don't know what it does, probably 550 miles an hour, so it's fast, but it's a hell of a lot slower than a single-seater. I had thought of this as being sort of almost suborbital in terms of flight, and therefore rocket-shaped. It had to take off vertically because of going through the pool, and if it took off vertically, it's not going to get anywhere on Earth. It's going to go up vertically. Sooner or later it's got to curve and change into horizontal flight. And the moment it changed into horizontal flight, it had to vary its geometry in order to stay up in the air. That meant it had to have wings that extended. The pilot would be facing, having to sit up like I'm sitting up, and therefore when they went into a vertical flight, the chair I asked, to be put on a swivel so that he would always be sitting in the correct gravitational position. And that one was designed by Derek Meddings, but that was pretty much as I described it.
Of equal importance was the creation of the characters, starting with those of the Tracy family. With the space race still very much at the forefront of popular culture, the 5 brothers who manned the Thunderbirds craft would each be named after a real-life astronaut.
It starts off with an ex-astronaut and his sons. That's how the characters begin. I think it was the Mercury program at that time. They were given the names of the astronauts because it was a space show and it just seemed a hell of a good idea at the time.
Despite Thunderbirds being filmed in Britain, a central cast of largely American characters was of vital importance if the show was going to be an international success.
We were spending a huge amount of money on this show. In today's terms, we were spending $500,000 plus on each episode. So we're talking about £16 million. 16 million, 20 million pounds for a television series is big bucks, and for children it's just huge. And I knew that it had to sell well in the States. There was a great resistance in the States at that time to British product. One option was to make a story about British people and bring an American character into it. And unless the American character was going to be the lead, it was of no value. So, you either made a film about New Scotland Yard and somehow engineered it that an American detective took the lead, which I always felt was pretty offensive to people here and pretty unbelievable to people in the States. Or the other route, which I much preferred, was to make it an American picture, which happened to be made on location in England. Thunderbirds was made in Slough, but it was an American picture. That was the thinking behind it. And we went to great lengths to make it American. We used to print the scripts on American Quarto, not A4. So that when the Americans picked the scripts up, they didn't feel alien. We used to use American spelling in the scripts. We were very, very careful on accents. The Canadians, for instance, would say oot instead of out. And these are the little points we used to watch so as not to give the game away.
However, Thunderbirds was still a British show, and Gerry was very aware of the importance of keeping the British end up.
It made sense for it to be an American picture and have American characters. We had to represent the British somehow, and how do we represent the British without lousing up the show? I thought that what do Americans laugh at? They laugh at British aristocracy. So therefore we have lady. Well, we don't want a lady thingy-bob who's 65 years old. We want a good-looking dish, so we have Lady Penelope Crichton Ward. We have her mansion, which is very attractive. And where do all American tourists go when they come over here? They go to the stately homes, don't they? What else do they understand? They understand Cockney. I mean, everybody in London at the time was a Cockney. How many people in America at that time had been outside America? Very few. And so all they knew about England was aristocracy and Cockneys. So this gave us Penelope and Parker. Once you start thinking about these things and reasoning it, it begins to work itself out. Lady Penelope, she would have a Rolls Royce. She would have a Rolls Royce, she'd have a driver. Okay, so the driver is a Cockney. And because she was a member of International Rescue, then she did all these things and she had all these gadgets.
Of course, every great British secret agent has to have an equally great British car when they're out on missions. James Bond had his Aston Martin, and Lady Penelope would have Fab 1.
We have a Lady Penelope to represent or to interest the English audience and to amuse the American audience. It follows, therefore, that she has the best car in the world, which has to be a Rolls Royce. The dateline was in the future, so it has to be a new design. She's leading a very dangerous life, and therefore it follows that, if you take a simple example, she would have a bodyguard carrying a revolver. If you take it a step further, on the back floor you would have a submachine gun. You take it a step further, and you start developing all these devices. As I say, it comes from logically thinking it through, and these things gradually materialize in one's mind. Having said all of that, I did not design Fab 1. I didn't build it. I say over and over again, there was a very clever team, and although I was in the luxury position of looking at sketches and saying yes, no, like that, and a bit of that and a bit of that. The fact is that a lot of the stuff was great that came into me, and although the ideas were based upon stuff I had written, much of it was different to the way I had envisioned it. So I never want to come over as Mr. Big who takes credit for everything, but yes, I did trigger these things.
The voices for the Thunderbirds characters would be supplied by several actors who had worked for the Andersons before, plus quite a few new names, many of whom would return in later productions. As happy as they were to bring in new talent, the Andersons were also keen to engender a sense of loyalty among the regulars.
When it came to voices, I think we were always pretty loyal to all the people. If people are working well with you, and if you're happy working with them, and if they give you no trouble, and if they help you make a great success, if you have any decency in you at all, I think you obviously want to help them, provided it's not to the detriment of the picture. So there would be the pool of people that we had used in the past that we would clearly consider. Then there would be people that they themselves would recommend to us. I've got a friend, or I was working the other day in a studio and there was a brilliant guy, his name is, and like everybody else we would watch television and listen to radio, and if you're in production and you hear an interesting voice, you make an inquiry, who is that? And so you now interview all these various people, audition them, they would be given a rundown on the characters, and then they would read for the part.
In the early days of Supercar and Fireball XL5, The puppets had maintained the same cheerful expressions on their faces no matter how dangerous the situation was or how dramatic their voice sounded. On Stingray, a way had been found for the puppets to better reflect the performances of the voice artists by sculpting heads featuring different expressions for the regular characters, and this method remained in use throughout Thunderbirds and into later productions.
The problem was that I used to direct the dialogue recording, and there was a very good reason for this, because we had a number of directors and we would be recording the dialogue for a film that was to be shot maybe 6 weeks hence. Say we shot 2 pictures in one day, well, those 2 directors weren't necessarily available. So I used to direct the dialogue, because apart from directing performance, I was that close to the scripts that I was able to instantly say, when you're calling base, the aircraft is spinning out of control. So, you've got to put the stress and strain in your voice, and you've got to be shouting above the engine noise. And here you're whispering, because round the other side of the wall is Lady Penelope talking to, and you don't want her to overhear you. So it was only not only a question of directing performances, it was also a question of steering the artists, who were totally blind. They didn't know what the hell they were reading, and telling them where they were, what kind of frame of mind they were in, whether they were projecting, whether it was conversation, whether it was radio. If it was radio, it was always spoken, much more slowly and with great clarity, because at that time, radio was difficult to understand. You start off at a recording session, and I'd find myself saying to an artist, look, you're really mad, okay? So you're screaming at this guy. And that would be fine at the recording session. Now I'd go to rushes and see this the same face, shouting one minute and near to tears the next moment and laughing the next moment, always the same face. Now, the puppeteers used to put a curl on the mouth and shape the eyebrows, and they used to do a certain amount to alter the expression, but there was a limit to what they could do. We had the standard head, which was as far as possible an all-purpose expression, kind of I'm content, and it would not do for any kind of extreme. Then we would have the smiling face. We would have a head where the eyes could blink. This was usually if a character had to fall unconscious or go to sleep. And on certain characters we had the very unhappy, frowning face. And these heads we used to literally interchange for various sequences.
Continuing another trend that had its origins in previous productions, Thunderbirds would also see many guest character puppets turning up again in later episodes, although Gerry wasn't their biggest fan.
We had all the permanent characters made and duplicated. It took a long time to create a character and make the head from fiberglass and therefore make it permanent. And we had a whole series of so-called revamps. Now, the revamps were full puppet bodies, and they had heads with eyes, which had, all the eye movement, and they had mouths, or a mouth opening, with an electronic mouth movement, but they were faceless. The face was rather like a half an egg, and for characters that were only going to make one appearance, they used to sculpt the face by pushing the plasticine onto this egg former, and then sculpt the face until it was approved, paint it up, and when we shot the picture we would just tear the face off and the revamp was hung up, ready for the next episode. I was very, very unhappy with the revamp characters. I did not have a lot of time for them. I mean, even going back to the Thunderbird pilot.
I've been dreading this moment. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking.
The pilots of the Fireflash, I thought were awful.
Yeah, I know.
But we had simply run out of time, and that's the best we could get by the time we were due to start shooting. But I was generally unhappy with revamped characters. But when we had a character that came off well, we found a voice that suited the character, characterization all meshed, we then would keep that character, albeit with a plasticine face, but it would be stored very carefully. And we ended up by taking photographs and having a little book, which was like a mini version of Spotlight, where we would, halfway through the series, we would turn the pages and say, well, he would be, that kind of face looks the sort of face, a bit villainous or laughing boy, banking type, whatever. We'd say that face looks right. Now, if we rip the moustache off and maybe put a beard on and take the blue eyes out and, put much darker eyes in or whatever, we used to revamp in that way too. We would take a revamped character and subtly alter it by altering the eyes, eyebrows, moustache, beard, and so on. So there was always a lot of work to do building these new characters.
By December 1964, it was time for Gerry's almost annual tradition of taking the first episode of his new series to show to Lew Grade. His unexpected response to what he saw would present massive challenges to the future of Thunderbirds, but also helped to ensure its longevity.
The series was commissioned by Lew as a half-hour series. When episode 1 was completed, it took this long for him to see, and I sat next to him. We were alone in the theatre.
We're not going to make it. We're running out of runway.
And the lights went up, and he leapt out of his chair. I thought he'd gone bananas. He just leapt out of his chair, and he turned on me. He pointed at the blank screen. He said, "This is not a television series. This is a feature film. You've got to make this as an hour." Well, now, of course, I was pleased, but also filled with terror. Here was this big machine rolling, and the guy says, "You've got to make it an hour."
Boys, I think we're in business.
Lew always worked on the basis that if he asked me to do something, somehow or other I would turn myself inside out and do it. And most of the time that proved to be correct.
With 9 episodes already completed, plus 2 more in production, Lew Grade's decision would require a drastic overhaul to the setup at AP Films going forward if they were going to be able to keep up with his demands.
I went back to the studio and said, "Look, we've got to make hours, panic stations to add material, script material, for the first 9, and then at a given point we would switch back to episode 1 and pick up the additional 30 minutes of material for each episode." It used to take 10 days to shoot a half-an-hour episode, so guess what it took to shoot an hour episode? It took 20 days, 4 weeks.
And it wasn't only Lew Grade putting pressure on AP Films.
The Americans were anxious to sell the show and get it on air quickly, because obviously it was a lot of money going out, and if shows were going on air, then money was coming back in. As a result, of course, we had to do computations, to work out how many shows they would have to have in stock before they could transmit 1 a week, and we would have the last episode ready in time to go on the air. And the New York office insisted that they had to have 1 show a fortnight.
It had been the simplest of things for Lew Grade to say that each episode had to double its length, but little did he realise that this would also involve doubling up most of the AP Film Studio machine in order to get the series finished on time.
We had to double up pretty well everything. It was at the point when Lew had said they've got to be an hour, followed by New York saying, but we've still got to have 1 every 2 weeks, that we then had to make a full set of replica puppets. We had to replicate some of the major special effects models, and of course you can't have 2 units shooting on the same stage. Apart from the fact there's not enough room, the light from one set would spill onto the other. One set of directions would be heard by the other crew. We had to have separate stages. And so we virtually doubled up on the puppets, doubled up on a lot of the sets. We would have taken on more people, doubled up on stages, crews, cameras. And then, of course, we had to build that much more in the time. So we had to reinforce set construction, property making, dirtying down, and indeed right the way through, writers. Everything went at twice the speed.
Despite the race to get the shows produced, the longer length of the episodes allowed for something that Gerry later felt was one of the reasons behind the enduring appeal of Thunderbirds.
If you've got more time, you can obviously devote more time to character development. If you take a character and put that character in jeopardy, an audience will either sit on the edge of their seat, filled with concern, or they won't be the least bit interested, depending on how well you have set that character up in the first place. And so suddenly we were able to take a bunch of new characters, make them interesting, make them likable.
Okay, let's go see this store.
But how do we get there?
That way, Blanche. Follow that sign to the monorail.
And at a point where we felt the kids knew enough about these characters and had gotten to like them, that is where disaster would strike.
Joe! Joe, look!
Place is on fire. They've shut us in. Open this door!
And then, of course, it became desperately important to the kids that they should be rescued.
I can't hold out much longer, Joe. Oh, Joe, why don't they come?
Who, Blanche? Who? Don't you see? No one can get us out of this now.
And so, in a way, I've always felt that part of the success of Thunderbirds was the fact that it was an hour as opposed to a half an hour, because it enabled us to give the characters much more development than we were able to do on previous shows.
Today, more than 50 years after the series first appeared on our screens, Thunderbirds is often regarded as the pinnacle of Gerry Anderson's television and film career, but it certainly wasn't produced with that goal in mind.
If you think about it, the whole process was, Twizzle Torture was that much more advanced. Four Feather Falls, another advanced supercar, Fireball XL5 with effects, Stingray with colour in the new studio, and now, you know, the new studio we were in, where everything was up and running, everything was working well. It was another big step forward, but I think what happened was that the steps we were taking forward were becoming bigger and bigger steps. I didn't consciously say this is going to be the biggest series we're ever going to make. It was simply going to be, and this one is going to be bigger and better than the last.
Back in 1965, Thunderbirds really was the biggest production AP Films had yet created, and one of the most spectacular shows that had ever appeared on television. Today, more than 50 years later, the show is still just as spectacular and just as popular, and it's all thanks to the hard work and dedication of Gerry Anderson, and Sylvia Anderson, and Derek Meddings, and Reg Hill, Barry Gray, John Reed, Bob Bell, Alan Patillo, Christine Glanville, and the dozens of talented artists and technicians that not only brought Thunderbirds to life, but made it into a television phenomenon that has endured for over half a century and will surely continue to delight and enthrall audiences young and old for many more years to come.